It's Alicia Kay. It's a couple days before the new year. I'm in a spot where I don't think I'm going to be finishing any more books before the year ends. So I am going to start my end of year wrap up type content. I don't know how many videos I'm going to make that are specific to the end of the year, but this is one I've been thinking about for months. I've been excited about for a long time because I am going to go look at my StoryGraph stats. Now, this is something I do frequently throughout the year. I check on my stats. I see how many books I've read, how many pages, format, languages, all that sort of thing. I check on it regularly, and I think it's really interesting, so I wanted to make a video about it. Before I dive in, just wanted to acknowledge I'm filming in a new setup, and yes, there's just like a scarf hanging on a picture frame that was super reflective. It's fine. I'm still figuring things out for this setup, and this is the best option we have. I don't know if you can hear the honking, but someone is just honking a lot outside. And it doesn't sound like their alarm is going off. It's like they're very deliberately honking. Anyway, I hope that doesn't last super long. Okay, I have my StoryGraph pulled up. I'm on the stats page. It is the year 2023, and we're going to look at my stats. So the first thing it shows you is the number of books you read. And I have read 86 books, which comes out to 27,727 pages. And honestly, I am happy with that number. In years past, I have read over 100 books in a year. And I just don't think for my life where I am, what I'm currently enjoying doing and how I'm spending my time, over 100 books makes sense for me anymore. And actually, a couple years ago, I deliberately tried to lower the amount of books I read because I was using reading as like an unhealthy coping mechanism. Not that reading's bad, but the way I was doing it is I would read in order to avoid the things I really wanted to do, but was like kind of scared to do. So for example, as a singer-songwriter, I would read to avoid working on the music I wanted to release. And then I'd be sad when I didn't release any music. But also, since that's scary and hard and takes a lot more work and isn't just like, oh, reading and then like talking about the books I read on YouTube sometimes, it's much more like emotionally invested. I'm much more invested in it. I care a lot more about it. I was using reading kind of to not make myself feel the fear, or like if I never did it because I was reading, then I wouldn't have to worry about people not liking what I made or like me not liking what I made. Anyway, I intentionally have been reading less. 86 books I'm happy with. I think that's a good number for me to be at. And I feel like this number has also allowed me to do the things I want to do. I released a song this year. I'm hoping to release more songs coming in 2024. My goal is 3. Wish me luck. I took up painting this year, and I can paint and like listen to audiobooks at the same time. So I think this is a good number for me right now in my life. I'm going to scroll back up for a second because I'm interested. Oh, never mind. I know what that does. There's like a little contents button. If you click on it, it just jumps you to the next thing. So, first thing after how many books I read is the mood of the books. This is interesting to me because, as you can see, I read adventurous or mysterious, adventurous, and dark books as like my top 3. With mysterious, and I'm not surprised about this at all, mysterious being my top mood, with 33 books falling into that category. I say I'm not surprised by this because keep an eye on this throughout the year, just because I like to know. But also, I read mystery books, and my favorite genre, I think, is sci-fi. So between mystery and adventurous, I think both of these kind of fit in this similar vein of a lot of sci-fi books also have some sort of mystery or adventure in them. So that's kind of like the mood of the sci-fi book. Even though the genre is sci-fi, the mood will be mystery or adventure. My least read mood was informative. And this, I think, is a switch from years past because I didn't read as much nonfiction this year as I have done in other years. Nonfiction has been a struggle for me the past year, maybe 2 years. And I'm trying to bring it back up. But the issue is I got stuck in a couple books. And the one I'm currently in, I'm reading. I don't even know if I want to read it, so I might have to DNF it. And then I took 6 months. It literally took me like 6 months to read Braiding Sweetgrass. And it's not because I didn't like the book. It's just because of the style. I sometimes kind of forgot about it. Because I'd read an essay and then I'd put it down. And it felt like it was complete. Like I'd finished the essay. So I didn't necessarily feel like I had to go back and read more. So those are my moods. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. I'm just going to do a quick look over. Yeah. Emotional at 26. Dark at 28, adventurous at 32, and mysterious at 33. Makes sense to me. Next is pace. So, as you can see, medium-paced books are what I mostly read. And I'm not surprised by this either. Again, I keep an eye on this throughout the year. I also just think most people, in my anecdotal experience, most people mostly read medium-paced books. That just feels like what most books are. And then you get a couple that are slow and a few more that are fast. But the vast majority of what people are reading is medium-paced. So after pace, we get page number. Now, this is another one that does not surprise me at all. And I think is interesting because this is, I think, the first of these infographics where there is like feelings, not my feelings, but people have feelings about page length. And people have feelings about people who don't read long books, or people have feelings about people who don't read short books. And I think that's all kind of unnecessary. Please hold. I'm going to take a quick pause to go turn off my heater so you don't have that and this. So, as I was saying, page number is, I think, where people start to have feelings. I know there's definitely people I've heard talk about, like, if you don't read books, long books, they kind of look down on you almost. And they think reading shorter books isn't as good. Like, this is definitely an opinion. People don't really, like, say it so plainly. But it's definitely an opinion I have seen, is people will judge you based on the length of your book. I'm not about this here. Whatever kind of length you want to read is great. As you can see, most of the books I read are between 300 and 500 pages. Cool. I think that is mostly just because of the genres I read. Most of the books fall into that length. And then I get some of the under 300s when I get into cozy mysteries, when I read books in Spanish, and I try to actually tend to go for shorter ones since it takes me longer to read in Spanish. But I also am not scared of reading books that are over 500 pages. It just doesn't align with the genres I read as often. A lot of the books that I see that are over 500 pages are high fantasy, and that is like a genre I'm actively trying to read less of so that I have more time to read other books, specifically sci-fi. So I think this is interesting just because it reveals my habits. I like medium-paced books that are mysterious or adventurous between 300 and 500 pages. That's what I gravitate towards. That's my reading personality, I guess. Next, we get into nonfiction and fiction. As we talked about, I didn't read as much nonfiction this year as I have read in years past, and I'm kind of trying to bump back up my nonfiction. Most of what I read is fiction. I don't think I'm ever going to have a complete swap where most of what I read is nonfiction. I'm never going to get to the point where, honestly, nonfiction is even close to like 50%. That's just not how I read. I have in years past tried to read one nonfiction book a month, and I haven't done great at that. This year especially, it took me like 6 months, like I said, to read Braiding Sweetgrass, but that might be my goal. I don't know if 2024 I'm going to really try, or at least in the beginning of 2024. The other thing with nonfiction is I am annoying about it for myself because I will only read nonfiction in the physical format that I own. I don't know why. I don't know why I don't like to listen to nonfiction. And that is because I want to read it at the pace I decide. And it's easier for me to segment out a nonfiction book if I have it physically. Most of the time I want to own it so that I can mark it. And this has kind of created a little bit of a hurdle as I don't have as much money to buy books. I'm not reading as many of the nonfiction. Also, it can be hard to manage multiple books at a time. And one always kind of feels like it's slipping. And especially in school, I think my nonfiction has suffered because I'm like, oh, well, if a book is going to slip and I'm not going to read it as much, it's going to be the nonfiction book. Like, I'm not going to not read my fun sci-fi book. I'm going to not read the nonfiction. And that's, I don't know if it's good or bad. Honestly, it's a neutral thing, right? If I'm having a hard time managing reading multiple books, one's going to slip, it's going to be the nonfiction. But like I was saying, I do kind of want to bring this number back up as I'm finishing school and maybe having a little bit more like emotional space to read nonfiction and time and mental energy to like plan it out. And also I think I'm going to start picking up some of them from the library. The ones that I don't feel like I need to have. That's a thought to help me read more nonfiction. The next thing we get into is genres. So this is fun. I like this. Some of these though, like, I don't know. Some of these genres are always interesting because, for example, my number 2 genre is LGBTQIA+. And like, I understand why they have it as a genre, but is it really a genre? Like, is saying this book is queer a genre? Or is that like a mood? Is that an aspect of the book? Also, I will read books that are tagged as like sci-fi and fantasy and something else. And that's fine, but the only thing it makes me wonder is how it counts. And honestly, it counts for both. I don't know. It makes me curious about the breakdown of the numbers behind the scenes of this lovely little infographic. So my top genre this year was sci-fi. And this is something I really wanted and I have been working for years. Because in the past, my top genre, I think if we go back to 2022, for example, and we go down to genre, it was mystery. And fantasy beat out sci-fi in 2022. I also only read 36 books. So it's not quite the same numbers. I was not reading as much. 36 felt like a little less than I wanted to. The year before in 2021, I read 114 books. That was too many for me. That was too much. It took too much of my energy and time. And again, fantasy was my top genre and sci-fi was number 2 in 2021. So now if we go back to 2023 and we go to genres, I have been working for this for years because I realized, I think in 2021, even with fantasy being my top genre, that it wasn't my favorite genre. I realized towards the end of 2021 that sci-fi was my favorite genre. In 2022, I didn't read a whole lot. 2022 was kind of a rough year for me. And I wanted to have sci-fi as my top genre, but fantasy still beat it out. So, quick interjection. Sorry if you can hear noise. I don't know what's happening in my condo, in my apartment. I don't know if my upstairs neighbors are vacuuming. I don't know who's vacuuming. It also sounds like someone is just like banging metal on, or like banging a stick onto our metal railing outside. So if you can hear vacuuming noises or metal banging noises, I apologize. I'm just going to power through. We're going to talk about genres and then we're going to move on. So as I was saying, before I got distracted by the noises, I worked very hard to get sci-fi to be my top genre. I like fantasy, and I probably will always read fantasy, but I realized when it was my top genre that I was just like, yeah, these books are good, and even some of these books are super well written, but I'm like, I like the sci-fi I'm reading more, even if it's not quite as objectively well written. So I was like, okay, I need to focus on sci-fi. And it took me a little bit of time to get here, but we're here. Sci-fi, number 1 genre. LGBTQIA, number 2 genre. Mystery, number 3. And fantasy comes in at number 4. I'm okay with this. I like how these are stacking up. I like that thriller is up there. Historical is up there, which is I'm actually kind of surprised about. I don't feel like I read that many historical books. But this would say otherwise, as it is in my top, 6? I like this breakdown. And I think fantasy is okay at number 4. It might fall, it might rise in coming years. This is another one where like the numbers would be interesting to take out from both sci-fi and fantasy, the books that are listed as both. Or to make them choose. Because I know that the Jim Butcher book, The Aeronauts Windlass, is listed as sci-fi and fantasy. For me, that's a fantasy book. And it shouldn't be counted as sci-fi. But it's listed as both, so it's counting towards both. And then there are other books that are listed as both that I think should just be sci-fi. Because I'm like, this doesn't feel like fantasy to me. But they're kind of intertwined. They're so intertwined that it's hard to say. And I think there are some people who would disagree and say like, oh, well, The Aeronauts Windlass is steampunk, so therefore it's sci-fi. And that's just, like, genres are weird. And I think they're interesting, but they're not a precise science. But I'm happy sci-fi is number 1. I do think it's interesting that I read 7 books that count towards romance. I don't really like romance. But again, this might change over time. I mean, all of these vary each year and what I'm reading and what I'm into that year. I also like horror at 10, but that's another genre that I might try to read more of. But I don't know. I personally struggle with the difference between horror and thriller sometimes. And what's a horror? Am I going to like horror? Because sometimes I'll read horror and I'm like, oh, that was really scary. And sometimes I'll read horror and I'm like, that doesn't feel very scary. And same with thriller. Those are two genres that I feel like have a lot of overlap. And finding what I like in those genres sometimes is hard. But I also have read some books I really like in both of those genres. Okay, moving on. I'm going to move on. Moving on from genres. Oh, format. This one's interesting. I think this one's really interesting for me because this is the first year I've tracked what format I've read, and the number on here is not 100% accurate. As you can see, there are 2 books that don't have a format listed, and those should be listed as digital. And then there's also 1 book that is in print that also should be digital. So the digital pie should be a little bit bigger. The print pie should be a little bit smaller. And audio is about the same. This was an interesting one to track throughout the year because there was at one point during the year where my audio pie was like almost, my audio section was almost 60% of the pie. It was by far my highest, what is this called? Format was audio. So as you can see, I've listened to 388.73 hours of audiobooks. And they account for 44% of my reading. Print is my next highest, and it is listed at 42%, but it would be lower. It's probably, I'm just going to throw out numbers. Print is probably like 38%, and digital would then be 18%. I'm throwing out numbers based on guesstimates of if the print book, the book that's counted as print, went over to digital. And maybe the other 2 books were also counted as digital. So this, I think, was really interesting for me. Also because it changes so much based on the time of year. When school is going and I'm like commuting to school every day, I think audiobooks are what I read the most because I listen to them while I'm commuting. During break, during summer is kind of 50-50 because over the summer I did commute up to campus to work. So I'd listen to audiobooks while I commute. I also take that time to listen to podcasts or whatever I feel like listening to. But often it's not uncommon for me to be listening to an audiobook on my commute. And that's how I get through so many audiobooks. I'll turn them on while I'm commuting. I'll turn them on while I'm doing things around the house, whatever. But when I'm not commuting as much during summer break, during winter break, this has been huge, I don't listen to them as much. They're not as much of a thing when I'm on break because I'm not commuting. And more often I'm finding time to sit down and read my physical book. I'm turning on music and listening to my physical, or reading my physical book, whatever. So this is an interesting thing that also would be interesting for me to track throughout the year, I think, to really see, because this feels like it has peaks and valleys and things like that. Next is my most read authors. Becky Chambers is number 1. Of course, I read 4 Becky Chambers books. I reread The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I reread A Psalm for the Wild Built. I read the second book in A Psalm for a Wild Built. I'll just pull it up. This one I'm happy to just look at. Prayer for the Crown Shy. Oh yeah, and then I read To Be Taught If Fortunate. So these are the Becky Chambers books I read this year. Super happy about that. I love Becky Chambers. And I do think I'm going to be rereading more of her stuff in 2024. Next was Mia P. Manansala. I read 2 of her books. Peter Brown. Oh, this is okay, these are books I read in Spanish. It's the Wild Robot series. And this might be one of them that didn't have the format correctly. All of the books that had format issues and listed it as the incorrect format were books I read in Spanish. Ellie Alexander is an author of a cozy mystery series. Megan Miranda, Sandra Cisneros, Vivian Chen, and Grady Hendrix. All with 2 books. Okay, now we get into languages. I read most of my books in Spanish, or in English, excuse me. Close to 90% of my books I read in English, with just over 10% being in Spanish. With at 9 books. So just over 10%. If we're looking at percentages, I read in Spanish. I'm proud of that number. I would like it to be a little higher, and I think it will get a little higher as I really continue to focus on reading in Spanish. I think this was the first year I actually was like, why don't I read in Spanish? I speak Spanish, and I don't get an opportunity to practice that often, but if I read books in Spanish, it will help. And I want to start listening to books in Spanish because I think that will really, really help. I listen to podcasts, not as often as I should, but I do listen to podcasts in Spanish. And I try to practice with people when I can. But yeah, this is all like so I can continue learning. And then also I just started in the latter part of the year trying to talk about the books I read in Spanish in my wrap-ups and reviews in Spanish so that I can get the practice of actually speaking, even if it's not to a person who can respond to me immediately. It's still good for me to practice. Okay, next we get the graph of the number of books and pages. So this, I think, is where we're gonna end up. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm not going to finish any more books, so this graph is not going to change. 86 books, like I said at the beginning, 27,727 pages, and a nice little graph of how many books I read. So I think my top, let's see. Oh, so I had 3 months where I read 12 books. May, June, and October. All of those months, I read 12 books. You will notice a correlation between 2 of them and one that's not like the other. May and June are summer months. I'm done with school. I'd finished school in April. So May and June, my reading shot up because I was done with school. October, however, the other month where I read 12 books, and this is why I felt like I read too many. I was in school, and this semester was a lot. I had a lot to do. I had a very intense project, and I still read 12 books, and it felt like too much. In May and June, it didn't. I'm intrigued by July and August. In August, I only read 3 books, and in some ways that makes sense because that's when school was starting back up. But it's just an interesting thing to look at because it really, like, January and August were my lowest reading months, and January makes sense. I was in school. Also, it's the start of the new year, and honestly, sometimes at the beginning of the new year, I just don't want to read. I don't know why, but sometimes I just don't want to. August was the start of me working nonstop on my project. And the numbers only started to shoot up again when I really started listening to audiobooks again. And yeah, we're going to finish December with five books read. So that's what this month was and is, and that's fine. That's great. I don't pay as much attention to number of pages, but just for funsies, my highest number of pages was in October. I shouldn't have done it. I mean, I'm glad I finished all those books. It was good fun, whatever. It stressed me out a little bit to feel like I had to read all those books. I'm almost done with school though, so this isn't going to be a thing in the future. The last thing on my stats is star ratings. I don't give star ratings. I tried for a few weeks to do star ratings, and I don't know why, I just don't do it. It doesn't work for me and my brain. It's not sustainable for me, so I just stopped doing it. Those are all the statistics from my year of reading for 2023. There are some other things I think it'd be interesting to track, and there is a way to do it with the compile, but I just don't have the energy or time to do it at this point. I will never say I'm for sure never going to do it, but at this point it's not happening. So this is what I have. I think Storygraph Plus gives you more options of tracking and statistics. I do not pay for that currently, so this is what I have. Thank you so much for coming along to look at my statistics with me. I hope you have a wonderful new year, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.